All right. Again, so depending on what food you consume is going to have different amounts of macronutrients of life. So, for example, animal products contain a higher amount of protein per gram than they have carbohydrates, whereas, for example, plants contain more carbohydrates than proteins. Okay. Now the question is, when it comes to me, when it comes to you as an individual, how much of the macronutrients of life do you need? And the answer to that, it depends on what you do on a daily basis. Obviously, if you're an athlete, right, and if you're doing a lot of strenuous exercise, you're going to require more macronutrients of life, right, in order to keep you alive. If you, on the other hand, are a person who is most of the time sedentary, which means that are not, doing exercise, right, obviously you're going to require less amount of macronutrients in order to stay healthy. Okay, so when you consume these macronutrients of life, they're basically big molecules. So what our body needs to do is to first break them down into individual components. So for example, the proteins, they need to be broken down into amino acids. So that way our body can use those individual amino acids to build different proteins. So once our body breaks them down into its individual components, then the cells within our body can actually use them. The first thing that happens is that it extracts the energy, okay? Because our body basically needs energy, the cells needs energy. And then each of those individual components, in this case amino acids, then they can be used to build different types of proteins. So carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are made out of a bunch of simple sugars. So let's say, for example, glucoses. So you have a bunch of glucoses that are bonded together. So what happens whenever you consume carbohydrates is that your body breaks down those carbohydrates into simple sugars, and then your body uses those simple sugars in order to build more complex carbohydrates. And your body uses carbohydrates as the primary source of energy. So they use carbohydrates first before they begin to use proteins and before they begin to use fat as a source of energy. The other function of carbohydrates is that they're important for cell-to-cell communication. So on the surface of your cells, you have receptors that are basically carbohydrates that allow that cell to communicate with another cell and to let me know that they're healthy, that they're fine. If a cell has been infected with a virus or a bacteria, right? So what happens is that the other cell doesn't get the proper signal, and so what happens is that cell signals, cells in your body, such as macrophages, to come and get rid of that cell because it has been compromised. Okay, so proteins. So proteins are made out of amino acids. So what happens whenever you eat, proteins are made out of many amino acids, is that your body breaks down the bonds that are holding each amino acid together. So whenever you're breaking any bond, you're basically releasing energy, and that's the energy that our body uses. So now that we have broken down the big protein into its individual amino acids, then what our body does is that it builds bonds again. And so it uses those amino acids to build different types of proteins, because there's a whole diversity when it comes to the function of proteins. So for example, some proteins keeps you healthy. So antibodies are basically the proteins that are fighting virus, bacteria, in order to keep you healthy. Other proteins are allowed you to basically to move around. And again, it's just like there's a whole diversity when it comes to proteins. All right, so fats. So fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Fats are basically what makes the majority of the cell membrane. And if you guys remember, the cell membrane is semi-permeable. It allows certain things to move in and certain things to move out of the cell. Okay, so the majority of the cell membrane is made out of lipids or fats. So essentially, if you get rid of the cell membrane, you're gonna kill the cell. Now, one important thing about fats is that if you were able to break down the fats, it's gonna give you triple the amount of energy. Now, the things about fats is that it also requires a lot of energy to get rid of those fat molecules. And this is why whenever you gain weight, okay, it takes a lot of energy. You basically have to exercise a lot in order to lose that fat. Nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are not considered one of the macronutrients of life. And the reason why they're not considered one of the macronutrients is because whenever they're broken down into its individual components, whenever they're broken down into nucleotides, they don't provide you with much energy. Okay? So does that mean that they're not important? No, I never said that. In fact, they are extremely important because without DNA, you don't have any of the other three types of macronutrients. The reason why they're not considered macronutrients is because they don't provide you with much energy. Okay, so we have essential nutrients. So the reason why they're called essential is because our body cannot make them, our body cannot synthesize them. And so we get those nutrients from the food that we consume. So for example, there are 20 amino acids. 9 of those our body cannot synthesize. And that means that we get those amino acids from the food that we consume. This is why it's extremely essential to have a variety in your diet. Because if you're not consuming certain foods, then perhaps you're not acquiring those essential amino acids, and eventually that could lead to some problems. So complete foods are foods that contain all the essential nutrients. All the nutrients are necessary to keep a person alive. So the ready-to-use food therapeutics, it's an example of complete foods. And an example of a ready-to-use food therapeutics, it's the peanut butter. And if you guys remember, the peanut butter, it's rich in fats, it's rich in proteins, and the Dr. Menner also added other nutrients that were essential to keep a person alive. So let's talk more about malnutrition. So malnutrition results from the chronic undereating, and keyword here, it's chronic, especially up to the age of 2 years. Our body, right, when you're little, there's all kinds of stuff that is happening in your body. So basically, the cells are dividing and dividing so that way you can grow. If your body, it's not getting enough of those nutrients, especially for long period of times, then what's going to happen is that your body's going to shut down, and essentially you're going to die. Now, does this mean that you're going to become malnourished if you don't eat for 1 day? If you don't eat for 2 days? No. Here we're talking about long periods of time. So we're talking about months. We're talking about years. So if you don't consume enough macronutrients of life for months or for years, then you will become malnourished.